All right, let's dive into one of modern history's most foundational and, let's be honest, most challenging texts, Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1. Now, our goal here isn't to debate Marx, but to really understand him on his own terms. We're going to trace the systematic argument he builds piece by piece, using his own evidence to diagnose the inner workings of capitalism. So where does Marx begin? Not with money, not with factories, but with the most ordinary thing you can imagine, the commodity. He says this is the basic cell of the entire capitalist organism, and by dissecting this one simple form, he believes we can actually uncover the genetic code, all the built-in contradictions that define the whole complex system. So we're going to follow his exact path. We'll start with the commodity, then we'll look at how value gets created through the struggle over the working day. We'll examine the game-changing role of machinery, diagnose the huge social consequences of all this accumulation, and finally, we'll explore the ideologies used to justify the entire system. Okay, first stop, the commodity. Marx insists that if you want to understand capitalism, you have to start here, because in this system, everything, even a person's ability to work, gets transformed into something that can be bought and sold. So what exactly is a commodity? Well, on the surface, it's just a useful object, right? Something that satisfies a need. But Marx says, whoa, not so fast. He argues that this is deceptive. Every single commodity has a hidden, two-sided nature, and inside this duality, that's where you find the central tension of the entire capitalist system. And here is that twofold nature. On the one hand, a commodity has a use value. This is its physical usefulness. A coat keeps you warm. Bread gives you energy. Pretty straightforward. But on the other hand, it has an exchange value. And this has nothing to do with how useful it is. It's all about what it's worth on the market compared to other things. This conflict between what a thing does and what it's worth is the key that unlocks the rest of Marx's entire analysis. Okay, so if labor is what creates value, how does a capitalist make a profit? The secret for Marx is what he calls surplus value. That's the value a worker creates beyond what they're paid in wages. And the most direct way to get more surplus, just make the working day longer. This is what Marx calls the production of absolute surplus value. Now, this is really crucial. Marx isn't just a theorist sitting in a library. He builds his case on a mountain of hard evidence, government reports, factory inspectors' testimonies. So this horrifying quote about match factories, it's not just some fancy exaggeration. It's the documented reality of a system driven to extract every single possible moment of labor time, especially from children. And this just brilliantly illustrates the cold, hard logic at play. When a steel manufacturer is asked about teenagers working through the night, the response isn't about morality or their well-being. It's a simple, rational calculation. It would cost more. For Marx, this isn't some uniquely evil capitalist. This is the voice of the system itself. This timeline really drives home a key point. The 8-hour or 10-hour workday that we kind of take for granted now wasn't just given to us. It was the result of a ferocious, half-century-long battle. Marx describes this period as nothing less than a civil war between the capitalist class and the working class, fought over the legal definition of a normal day. But what happens when you can no longer legally just make the day longer? Does the drive for profit just stop? Not a chance. Capital just finds a new and actually more powerful method, increasing the productivity and the intensity of labor within that limited time. And this is achieved through machinery, leading to what Marx calls relative surplus value. You see, from Marx, a machine is not a neutral tool. In the hands of capital, it fundamentally changes the worker. The skilled artisan, with a whole range of abilities, gets replaced by a detail laborer whose entire existence is boiled down to performing one repetitive task as a simple appendage of the machine. This quote from a factory owner is incredibly revealing. It's not just about the worker's time anymore. That time is now fused to a massive amount of capital tied up in the machinery. So any moment the worker stops, a huge investment is just sitting there, idle, losing value. This creates a powerful new pressure to keep the system running at all costs, at all times. And there's another incentive for non-stop work, something Marx calls moral depreciation. A machine loses value not just from being used up, but also from the simple fact that newer, better technology is always just around the corner. So a capitalist is in a frantic race against time to get the full value out of their machines before they become obsolete. So, we've got this system humming along. Now we can pull back and look at the grand social results.
This is where Marx starts to outline what he sees as the historical tendency of this entire process of accumulation.
On one side of the ledger, the accumulation of wealth is just staggering. Marx pulls directly from official income tax data to show the explosive growth in profits from the core industries of the time. This isn't just growth, it's an accelerating concentration of society's wealth into the hands of a few.
But at the exact same time, the conditions for the working population are catastrophic. Here, you have a government public health report describing urban housing not just as miserable, but as a direct threat, centers from which disease and death are distributed.
And this is the absolute crucial point. For Marx, the fact that immense wealth and immense misery exist side by side is not an accident. It is the fundamental law of the system. They are two sides of the same coin produced by the exact same process. In fact, he argues that the internal logic of capital itself, this drive towards centralization of wealth and the socialization of labor, actually creates the conditions for its own transformation. It's the seed of its own negation.
So, how is a system with such deep contradictions explained and justified? In our final section, Marx looks at the economic theories used to rationalize accumulation, and then he puts them to the test in the real-world laboratory of the colonies. One of the leading justifications for profit was the theory of abstinence. This theory framed the capitalist profit not as something taken from the worker, but as a fair reward for their own personal sacrifice, for abstaining from spending their money and choosing to invest it instead. As you can imagine, Marx treats this idea with some pretty sharp sarcasm. And this quote brilliantly exposes the system's core secret, which really comes to light when you look at the colonies. An economist named Wakefield saw that in places like America or Australia, where land was cheap and available, capitalism just couldn't take root. Why? Because if people can work for themselves, on their own land, they have absolutely no reason to sell their labor power to a capitalist. The system requires a large population that has been separated from the means of production.
For Marx, this colonial example reveals the system's foundational secret, and it leaves us with the deeply unsettling question that animates his entire critique. If modern capitalism requires a population to be separated from the means to work for themselves, then what is the true relationship between private property, economic progress, and human freedom? It's a question that drove Marx's work over 150 years ago, and one that continues to challenge and provoke us today.